He never got to see it, but I just got rid of the bangs. Completely. Ron encouraged me to be smart on television when women sometimes weren't welcomed to be. He told me to be tough, even when, actually especially when, it irritated the people I was interviewing. He taught me to seek the truth and never, ever take free speech for granted. So, it's going to come as no surprise, although it's a bit of a surprise, we hope, that as a member of the board of Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, I nominated Ron Haggart for this year's Vox Libera Award, which is presented only when the board thinks they have a worthy recipient. CJFE is the Canadian arm and the manager of the powerful International Freedom of Expression Exchange, which works here and abroad, I'm sure most of you know, to support, to protect, and often to rescue journalists, while constantly pushing the free speech envelope. Today, for instance, CJFE was before the Supreme Court of Canada arguing against speech regulations in human rights legislation, mainly to make it easier for journalists to protect free speech. In another case, CJFE right now is suing the Ontario government after some OPP officers impersonated journalists. This very prestigious award is granted to a Canadian who has demonstrated an outstanding commitment to the principles of free expression and has made an important and sustained contribution to those principles. Past recipients include Ellen Borovoy of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, of course, and Marlis Edward for her work as a prominent criminal lawyer and a civil rights activist. At CJFE, I have to tell you, there was, as usual, a rousing debate about awarding the prize this year, including this question. Actually, Ron would have loved the debate. It went on quite long. Isn't it the job of every journalist to uphold free expression? Isn't it? It is. But for Ron Haggart, it was more than a job. It was his credo. It was his crusade. And he will be a sustaining role model for many of us. So as usual, Ron got his way. And I'm here tonight on behalf of Canadian Journalists for Free Expression and its board to proudly announce that Ron Haggart will be the 2011 recipient of the CJFE Vox Libera Award. And I hope that you'll join us on November the 24th at the Royal York for the CJFE International Press Freedom Gala, where Ron's family will be on hand to receive this very important award. Thank you.
Well done, Paula. My name is Jim Back, and I used to be a publisher. Before that, I was a writer, and I still am. And in all of these careers, I was always running into Ron Haggart. He was funny, kind, generous, and he laughed when I told him a joke. Journalism thrives on innocuous controversy. He liked that, although he was no stranger to the real controversy that an honest writer, as he was, could get into. I loved the way he took on Leslie Frost, the former Premier of Ontario, who made things easy and profitable for Kalamazoo Vellum and Parchment Company in Northern Ontario by changing the law of Ontario to allow KVP to poison profitably the Spanish River. That this destroyed the lives of fishermen and others downstream did not bother Frost, but it really angered Haggart. He was a columnist of the Star at the time, and he took after Frost. And after Frost retired, he took on some profitable directorships, among them the KVP company. Ron found out, and he published an angry column about this chicanery And there were fears in the Star's boardroom, you can be sure, that this guy Haggart had gone overboard and they were going to hear from Frost via some law firm with 10 names. And lo and behold, into the pages of the Star came Leslie Frost himself with a letter which has been condensed for me from the page-long and rambling original by the marvelous device of human memory, whose true function is to forget stuff. This precious function, which lives strongly in me, has reduced Frost's ramble to a single sentence which runs something like this: Mr. Haggart's accusations are totally false because I served in the First World War and I've stayed married to the same woman ever since. So it was years later that I was all ready to listen to the pitch given me by Haggart and Gould when they decided to do a book on the October crisis. Perhaps you remember that in 1970, Canada and Quebec politicians were terrorized by some violent cells of the Front de Libération Québécois, or FLQ. The peaceable kingdom, as we thought we were, was stupefied by the gruesome murder of Pierre Laporte and the kidnapping of James L. Cross. Ron and Aubrey, who had already been working together, as Aubrey has just told us, came to me at New Press Book Publishers, where I was a founder and editor, and I was ready for them. We were their choice because Ron was in a hurry. Remember, he was a newspaper man first and author second. So we promised him a quick book, and a good one. He was in charge of the quality, except for the title, which I gave him, Rumors of War, from the Bible. Ye shall hear of war, said rumors of war, and which he very quickly accepted. It was a marvelous experience, taking him and that book through to publication. They were so professional, Aubrey and Ron, quick, able, and accurate. They knew their audience and they knew their subject deeply, and they were determined to protect civil liberties in our country, and they did. The book was an instant bestseller, though I doubt that either of them made more than plumber's wages with what I thought was exquisite work, and rapidly and accurately carried out, and never, so far as I ever knew, seriously refuted by anyone in government or out. That was how our friendship began, and it survived many years through till recently. Ron would come to our cottage on Georgian Bay with other friends of ours who are here tonight, Joe and Gloria Sheard, and Joe, a judge, and Gloria, a teacher, and we would eat magnificently, drink just barely too much, and go for long walks in the woods talking about the affairs of the world. He was a good friend, a good writer, and a good citizen.
Hello, my name is George Robertson. It's my privilege and pleasure to read these two tributes to Ron, as well as my own. The first is from Val Sears. Ron was my oldest friend. We met at the University of British Columbia shortly after the war, when Ron was editor of the college paper, the UBC, and I was managing editor. It was a lively time, with university bulging with veterans and a great deal of partying. Ron was better at this than most of us, who could not compete for sorority girls against ex-Spitfire pilots. After UBC, Ron went to the Sun and then on to Toronto and the Star. As municipal columnist, he joined a remarkable collection of top-flight journalists who included Pierre Burton, Nathan Cohn, and Marjorie Nichols. No one has ever written a better City Hall column than Ron, and it was delicious to read day after day. From the Star, Ron plunged into television and left his imprint on a series of documentaries for the Fifth Estate. In his final years, he drifted away from the media, except for an occasional lovely letter to the editor in the Globe. I do believe Toronto was a better city when Ron was watching over its government. He was a splendid writer, a master of the key anecdote, and an unsurpassed critic of the ignoble and the plain stupid. We may never see his journalistic like again. My second tribute is from Ron's old CBC colleague, and the colleague of many of us here, Robin Taylor, in England. I would like nothing more than to be present at this gathering to pay tribute to my friend Ron Haggart, but I'm sorry to say that although the spirit is willing, the body is woefully weak. I first met Ron in 1975 when he and I were invited to climb aboard the new Fifth Estate as senior producers. Ron was almost certainly born with printer's ink in his veins, and he came to television relatively late in his professional life. But at the Fifth, Ron was in his element. It was a program that seemed to be designed especially for him. Hard-hitting, investigative journalism with a large team of researchers, producers, and technical staff to get the job done. His role in the success of the program was paramount. More than anyone else, he provided the cutting edge to many of the stories on which the Fifth Estate built its reputation. It was in the development stages of stories that Ron went to work. Conversation was his weapon. He would talk for hours with producers and researchers about an idea. He wanted to know everything. He gave these master classes not only to producers and researchers in Toronto, but also to producers elsewhere in Montreal, Vancouver, and Winnipeg. God knows how much the phone bills added up to. Ron was no sergeant major barking orders around the office. He got his way most of the time by knowing more than anybody else. It was friendly persuasion backed by the facts. He was the most courageous of journalists when he wrote his columns in the Toronto papers, and he carried the impulse with him when he joined the Fifth Estate. But he was not reckless. Every claim had to be supported by the evidence. My lasting impression of Ron is of a late Sunday evening at Filmart, the film editing company where most of our stories were cut. We had been called out to screen an item for the following week's program. There were about 6 of us, but Ron had not arrived. That wasn't unusual. Ron Haggart and punctuality were not always on speaking terms. When he eventually turned up, he was carrying a brown paper bag. Inside the bag, he had a bottle of white wine, chilled of course, a packet of Scottish shortbread, and half a dozen superior plastic wine glasses. This was a typical Haggart gesture. In Ron's book, there was no rule that said we couldn't enjoy a glass of wine and a biscuit while vetting another Fifth Estate epic. Ron saw that as a fit and proper way to end a working day. That was from Robin Taylor. I first met Ron when I was a freshman at the University of British Columbia. I'd walked into the UBC office to declare my interest in being a reporter. Ron was already one of the paper's star reporters and editors. Another was Val Sears. I was 17, and they were a year or two older. As far as I was concerned, they were the height of sophistication. From Ron and Val, I learned a little about journalism and a little more about how to drink. I could only envy their skill with young female reporters. Not long ago, Ron was reminiscing about some of those early loves. When I told him that back issues of the UBC were available on the internet, he begged me to dig up a certain issue with a front-page photograph of our hero dining by candlelight with one of our reporters, who also happened to be a campus beauty. I searched and could not find her. He was sorely disappointed. I'd say bitterly disappointed. I understand, by the way, that Kelly has now found that picture among Ron's papers. He and I left the Fifth Estate and the CBC around the same time, in 1990. I moved back to Vancouver. Then began another phase of our relationship, first by telephone, then with his fax machine, and finally with his first primitive computer. He would bombard me with questions. I was now his unpaid researcher, maybe not the only one. What had happened to a certain former BC cabinet minister? When did the Pacific Great Eastern Railway become BC Rail? I mentioned Google to him, and the questions were fewer. Now he began sending me copies of scolding letters to heads of corporations, to petty officials and overweening bureaucrats, and to other newspapers and other journalists. Here is a typical one. Why would the Toronto Star publish the outrageous comic strip Mother Goose and Grimm, which portrays Hans Blix, head of the UN Arms Inspection Team in Iraq, as so stupid and dysfunctional that he cannot locate a carton of milk in his own refrigerator?